Hey, it's Andrew Mead. A couple of days ago, I asked you for questions on Twitter, and today we're going to go through and answer them. So, the first one: what blogs, sites, Twitter accounts, and podcasts do you use to stay up to date? I don't actually subscribe to any blogs or podcasts that are tech related. I find that those creators are on Twitter and they're posting about that stuff anyways. So I use Twitter for basically 100% of my tech news. What I'll do is I'll follow the creators of libraries I'm using. I'll see who they're talking with on Twitter, and I'll follow those people as well. Pretty soon, you get an interesting list of folks making interesting stuff. You know what's changing and when, and you also get some insight into how they plan to change the library in the future. All right, next question, and this was a common one. The question is, what's the best way to dive into building something from scratch? Tutorials are great, but how do you suggest applying that knowledge? My recommendation is always take baby steps and start with step number one. So if you're working on a new project and the first thing you do is open up Visual Studio Code, that's probably step 7 or 8. There are a lot of other things that were skipped, and those other things are going to make it much more likely that your project turns out as a success. So if I'm working on a client project, first 2 weeks or so, zero code is written. I'm working in pen and paper or in a wireframing tool, sketching out my ideas. I'm modeling out my data. I'm drawing the layouts for my user interface. And the reason I'm doing this is because it's really cheap to change. So my first 7 ideas are probably pretty terrible. But if I'm working in pen and paper, I can take a new idea, I can sketch it out in about 25 seconds, and I can figure out if it's better or worse than the old one. It's really fast to iterate. If I have a finished app and I want to change the layout, it's going to take hours or days to get things looking like I want them to, only then to realize it's not the best approach. So I'd recommend starting with pen and paper or a wireframing tool like Balsamiq to get your ideas out of your head and onto something where it's really easy to change. Now, once your idea is refined and it's not changing as often, then you're ready to start diving into some code. When you do, though, make sure to stick with baby steps. Use version control to iterate one small feature by one small feature so you can always revert and make changes and experiment. That's going to give you a lot of flexibility and you won't be so stressed out about losing everything you've worked on. So focus on very small features. Don't try to write an entire interface and then test that out, because if it fails, that's a lot of code to dig through. Write 6 or 7 or 8 lines of code, make sure that works, then continue building on it. I think there's also this idea that there's a learning phase and a applying phase that are very distinct, and that's just not true. You learn a little bit, then you apply it to a project, and as you work on the next feature, you realize you need to learn a little more, so you learn that, and then you apply it. You go back and forth between those two things, and that's okay. It's perfectly normal. I'm on Stack Overflow, GitHub issues, and documentation every single day as I'm working on projects, even if it's with a library that I've used a lot before. This is a very normal process. So the keys: sketch things out, get your idea onto paper, take baby steps. If something seems stressful to build, it's probably because you're trying to build too much. Don't worry about fancy animations or shadows until you have a basic interface in place. So you go from basic layouts to a basic interface, and then finally at the very end, you actually worry about what it looks like. Now, everyone's approach is different. That's what's worked well for me, and hopefully it can help you out a little bit as well. All right, next we have, is there any React Native course in the future? Right now, the answer is probably. It's not something I have concrete plans for just yet, but it is definitely on my short list of topics I want to teach. So keep an eye out for stuff about that. Next up, we have, how many programming languages and web technologies do you know? I only know one programming language, and it's JavaScript. I've used others before, but it's been over 8 years since I've seriously used another language. so I would consider my knowledge of those pretty obsolete. I'm really just a JavaScript developer, and that's okay with me. Next up, we have how do you spend your free time? What are your sleep schedules? I sleep about 10 to 6 or 10 to 6:30, and when it comes to free time, I try to get outside and away from screens as much as possible. So runs, bike rides, and just useless walks through Philadelphia, some of my favorite things to do. All right, next up we have, can you tell us how you started your journey as a developer? How did you get your first job? Did you always want to be a developer? Any advice for changing into tech? So I didn't always want to be a developer. I switched to computer science from architecture early on in college, and that's really when I got started. Now, when it comes to landing my first job, I did that by building a side project right after I graduated. It was a little support ticket app. Now, it made $0 and it got 0 customers, but it definitely played a huge role in me getting that job. It's because I had something interesting to talk about and share when I was in the interview. And that's always been my biggest piece of advice for new developers. You do not need a large portfolio. One project will do, and having one real-world project, even if it doesn't make any money and it has no users, is going to go a long way in that interview process when you're competing amongst a bunch of other entry-level candidates who don't have a project like that. As an example, I have a friend just landed his first tech job 9 months ago. He had never written a line of code. His approach was to take a couple of Udemy classes. Then he started to work on an Android app. It was a location-based chat app. Now, did he make any money off that app? No. Does he have any customers? Probably not. Did it help him land his job? Absolutely. Having that project in the interview to talk about and show off goes a long way. So that's what I would recommend if you're switching into tech. Take what you learn, focus on building something slowly over time, and once you have that one project and you feel confident about it, then it should be a lot easier to go through the interview process because you'll have real experience and something to show off. Next up, we have, I want to record my first course. What's your process? It looks like you do a voiceover on a video of you typing, which makes for a smooth production. Also, your speaking is clear and concise, so I guess you have a script. Would love to know more. So I actually don't use a script for any of my videos. I typically start off with a few code samples of where I want to end up and a couple of bullet points of key things to make sure I mention, but all in all, there's 0 script involved. It's just a lot of clips for each video and a lot of takes for each clip. So one 20-minute video might be 10 separate clips stitched together, and I might do all of those 2 or 3 times to end up with something that I'm happy with. I also do everything live, so as I'm talking, I am typing. I would find it pretty difficult to try to talk over a video of me typing because the pacing is so important. I'd be worried that I didn't have enough time to say what I wanted to say, so I just do everything live. All right, that's where we're gonna stop for this one. Now, this is my first Q&A video ever, so I'm still working on the formatting and the filming for these kinds of videos. This one is a little rough around the edges, but I hope to improve that over time. I also hope you got something out of this one, and if you'd like to see more like these, just let me know. If you have a question you'd like answered, just follow me on Twitter. There's a link down below, and I'll be tweeting out the next time I'm ready to film a Q&A. All right, I'll see you in another video sometime soon.